Hey y'all, we're back in the shop again on another installment on this truck. We've got a lot of things that we need to go over before I dive into the little film I have. It's been really busy lately and I've been juggling a bunch of different projects around, some that you may see on the channel, some you might not. There's a lot of other things I've been doing too. Been working on the house, I've been working a bunch extra, doing some oddball jobs on the side, and I also have a regular job too that pays the bills and keeps a roof over my head. So I've been a bit busy lately and it's been a bit hectic, but let's get into what I've worked on here so far. So in this video I want to go over basically what I've kind of done more or less with building the IDI engine for this truck. The engine came out of my brown and tan 1973 F250, and the reason why I took it out in the first place was because it had a really bad rear main leak and I was going through like a quart a week, and I don't really like leaving a giant oily mess on the ground everywhere I went. So that had to come out. You don't have to take the engine out to do a rear main, but I figured, you know, the other part of why I took the engine out was because I ended up getting a Power Stroke for $900 and all the computers and everything I needed to go with it. So it was, you know, pretty cheap, and it had 140,000 miles on it, give or take. And so I decided, hey, I'm gonna, you know, just stick that in that truck because I ended up getting this truck and I like this one. And as much as I like my first truck, my brown 73, that thing is up for sale right now, and it's on Craigslist in the Humboldt area, and I'm asking way too much for it, but you know, I want to maybe get back at least what I've sunk into it and pay for some other things, you know, maybe work on the house some more, maybe build another garage. I don't know. So since I had the Power Stroke and I pulled the IDI out, put the Power Stroke in, and more or less completed the old brown truck there, I might paint that brown truck. I'm thinking about doing that because I've welded in some fuel doors and they don't look very good right now because they're not smoothed out, and obviously there's no paint there, or there's some black rattle can that I had just to keep the rust from popping up. Those will look good if you put a little bit of glazing or a little bit of Bondo and you know, got everything nice and perfectly polished and then painted the whole thing again. I'd like to put it or take it back to the original blue color that it was, and then at that point I think I could, you know, get what I'm asking for it out of it. So there might be a video in the future on that. I'm not sure. I need to either sell that truck, or I need to go and learn how to do paint and body work, because I'll tell you right now, I'm not good at it, which is not a good thing because I got to do a bunch of paint and body work to this. So I had the IDI engine on the floor, and I was going to do a bunch of work to it, and I ended up, you know, I got this truck. So I figured, hey, you know, I like the IDI, I like this truck, we're going to make the two meet, we're going to make engine mounts and put this engine in this truck. And while we're doing that, why leave it stock? Why not, you know, enhance it a little bit? I'm not going full, you know, balls to the wall. I mean, I think compared to most IDI builds, I am going kind of all out. I put a Type 4 cam made by this guy named Russ up in Oregon. He's got this RV cam that he calls it, and it's supposed to move the torque further down the range, and also you maybe bump up the torque and a little bit of horsepower. Also, I got some manifolds and up pipes and the bellowed section from Justin at R&D IDI Performance. There's one little hiccup I ran into with that, which is not Justin's fault at all. It's because I'm using a turbo that was not designed to run on his kit, so that's on me. But I think I've come up with a way to get around that. Turns out a Hypermax with the neck modified works just fine. This truck is going to be intercooled as well, so I guess we are going all out on this. I guess the only difference is I haven't done any real work to the pump. I'll probably turn it up a little bit. I haven't done any injector work, and I also obviously haven't done any real turbo work because this thing could use a bigger turbo or a better turbo if I put some head studs in it. But for now, I don't have any head studs, and I don't have any enhancements in the bottom end. I don't have the total seal rings. I don't have Power Stroke rods. I just have the stock, you know, naturally aspirated bottom end on this truck. So I'm going to leave that part alone. So here's some highlights from what I was able to film in between doing all the other things I've been doing. Now then, for accessories, I decided I wanted to go with a serpentine because I am one of those weirdos who does not like the V-belts. Now, some guys say, oh, the V-belts are great because they're simple, and you know, if you lose at one V-belt, you're okay. If you lose two, you're okay. You know, if you lose all three, you're okay. One belt doesn't take out the whole system. However, I also don't like the alternator V-belt on these engines because it hangs down so dang low and it flops around, and it's just impossible to get tight enough. I always seem to have to come out here and crank down on it some more, and I haven't been satisfied with it. So I'm going to try the serpentine belt setup. It's on every other vehicle that I've owned ever, and you know, if the tensioner works like it's supposed to, then it should stay nice and tight. But I have heard horror stories about these tensioners, and I know some of you in the comments might chime in about that. I hear you. I'm going to give it a try. If it doesn't work for me, then that's just my dumb fault. But you know, I think that the serpentine setup is a superior way to go. Also, you get a more modern alternator. Yes, you can modify a 3G alternator with a V-belt setup. I did that on this engine before, and it worked great. But I also like, you know, how all this is laid out. It's just, to me, it just seems way more straightforward. So, besides from shimming it to get everything, you know, nice and straight, because these tend to want to walk off this pulley here because it's too small. I don't think there's any problems with this. Mounting the accessory drive, you have to get all the brackets, and those are IDI specific, but there's as simple as just pulling all the other old accessories off and mounting on the alternator mount, and then mounting this giant monstrosity, which is all of this stuff attaches onto the side of the head and the engine block. So even if you don't have the serpentine drive set up on your IDI and you want to get into your front cover, you need to remove some stuff to get to your front cover. Most notably, obviously, is the water pump. So there's a bunch of bolts for the water pump. You'll have to get a fan clutch tool and pull your fan off. I just haven't installed mine yet. I will in the future when I'm ready for that. Then you pull your pulley bolts off, and then that allows you to get in here to like the water pump bolts and the front cover bolts. On this particular setup, you don't have to take the alternator or the alternator bracket off to get to the front cover bolts on that side, and also on this side. I think you can leave this whole bracket on here to get all those bolts out for the front cover. Once you've done that, there's a bunch of front cover bolts down here. You take all those out. You have to get a pulley tool and remove the crank pulley. There's a big old 1-inch or 7/8, I can't remember, bolt on here. You gotta, usually I just use an impact gun and just rip that thing right off. And then once that crank dampener's off and the crank pulley's off, you can get in there and you can pull the front cover off, and then you're into the front cover, which I will show you my teardown and how easy it is to time this engine. Okay, so IDI, cam gear, and injection pump gear timing. It's really straightforward. It's not really hard to, it's easy to screw up if you aren't paying attention, but other than that, it's pretty easy to get this straight. So, on the cam gear here, you've got a dot. If you line that dot up with your crank dot on your crank gear, you're in time there. And then up here on top, you've got this Y. On the injection pump gear, which rides right here, if you line the Y up, you're in time with the injection pump. That's it. Down here is your oil pump gear. It is not really, it's not timed anything, so I wouldn't worry about that. But your oil pump's down here, it's gear driven, crankshaft, camshaft gear. Your camshaft has a retainer bolt up there and down in here. Now, when you're taking the cam out like I did earlier to do a camshaft swap or whatever, you're going to need to undo this Allen screw and then get a gear puller and pull this gear off. And then you can get in here and get these bolts out. Now, putting it back together, I put all this back together and I put this Allen screw in and then I put the cam in because it's actually pretty easy to walk this in out when you've got this big gear to grab onto. But putting it back together, if your gear is already attached, or if you pulled the cam out for whatever reason and we're gonna put it back in and didn't have to do anything to it, and you didn't mess with this stuff, all you have to do is just rotate this gear to align the window up with the bolts. You can get these bolts out with a wrench with moving the gear around to give you space to get in there. So that's what I did. I put the whole thing in there as one unit. I just lined it up to get my wrench in there to get these bolts. There's two in here. The retainer plate does have a position to it, but it's fine because it's not centered, so you can't put it in upside down or 180 out. You won't line up the holes. So there's only one way it goes in. So it makes it really easy to put it back together without having things backwards. And unlike the Cummins, the IDIs have a keyed shaft on the camshaft, so you also can't move your timing gear to time it. So no, you wouldn't want to do that anyways. So there's not much to it, but you're keyed here. Your crank is keyed, and I believe the injection pump is not keyed, but it has 3 screws that hold it to the pump to the gear, so you can't mess that up either. Alright, so if you're doing any top end work, then you're going to need to take your intake manifold off. What you need to do is you need to undo all your injector lines at the injectors. You don't necessarily need to take them off the pump. It can make removing the pump easier, but you don't have to do that. This bracket here for the throttle cable linkage, you take that bracket off. And then for the pump, there are these 9/16 nuts here. There's one on each side of the pump. And you take those off. These 3 nuts are for timing your pump, but you need to take them off so you can remove it from the housing. And then the timing gear that's in here, there are 3 12-point screws that all you have to do is take this cover off. Now some of these have this aluminum housing that's just for the breather, but otherwise it'll just be a flat plate like the front of this. So you gotta take this off, and then you get in there and you take those 3 screws out, and then you can pull the pump shaft off the gear. Do not remove the 4 bolts that hold this aluminum housing to the engine, because if you do that, you don't pull the front cover off, you will mess up the timing, and it's really hard to, I would say almost impossible to get that gear lined back up properly because you can't see it. So that's how you take the pump off. Once the pump's off, all you have to do is get in here and pull all the bolts off of the intake manifold. Obviously, if you have a turbo, the turbo's got to come off completely. And then at that point, you just need to get in here and maybe pull some ancillary stuff. Like for me, I have to pull the fuel filter housing off just because it's bolted to the intake manifold. And then the intake comes off. And then there's some bolts down here for that little plate right there. That holds down the front of your intake manifold gasket. So you pull those out, and then you can pull your intake manifold gasket off, and then you are open to the inside of the engine, where you can get to your lifters and your push rod. Your valley pan is a one piece. It's also your intake manifold gasket, so pretty straightforward. When you're putting this back on, I'm going to replace it with a new one. You run your silicone here, you run it back here, you set it down, you set your intake manifold down on here. There's a screw that goes here in the back to get this thing A, centered, and B, this is also your drain, your valley drain. This is your CDR, or for me, my turbo oil drain. So that helps get you centered. There'll be a hole, it's like an Allen or a square head screw that goes in here. It has a hole in the middle, so that way all the goop that leaks out of your pump or whatever, if you wash the hood or underneath the hood or whatever, all that water and junk and everything can drain out here, and it'll run down the back. If you have a oil leak or a bad like fuel leak or any kind of leak, it'll look like a rear main because it's going to run down both sides of the block. This is your oil pressure fitting. I'm not using that because the turbo's right here, so it's just blocked off. Another spot to get oil pressure is right here on the side of the block where the motor mount plate is. The one thing I don't like about IDIs are the push rods, and the only reason why I don't like them is because they are easy to screw up. So there is a harder and a softer end, but fortunately this little dot here, this is the rocker end, this is the lifter end. Okay, so since we added a camshaft and it's changed our lift, we need to take our old lifters out and clean them because the lifter has some adjustment in it, or hydraulic adjustment, whatever you want to call it. And with that extra lift, we could potentially stick a lifter, and that would be no good because we may hold a valve open and have a problem. So we're going to disassemble all these lifters. We're going to clean all the old oily varnish that builds up in these over time out and make sure all these work just fine, and then we're going to put them back in the motor. Here are the tools that you're going to need to take apart your lifters. You're going to at least need one pick with a curved end on it. I'm probably going to end up using this one more than this one. Some sort of flat end pick or pry bar or screwdriver. And I believe you're going to need this Phillips head for pushing the detent ball that's inside the lifter. The push rod is for reassembly. Alright, so in an IDI engine, it's got 16 valves, and so we've got 16 lifters. These are hydraulic roller. If you look at the bottom end here of the roller, this part rides on the cam. It's got a roller bearing in it, so it lasts longer than the later replacement style that uses bushings. So preferably you want to reuse these. You want to just check this whole roller surface, make sure there's no giant gouges. This thing's got some oil on it, so it might be kind of fooling you here on the camera, but with my eyeballs, it doesn't look bad at all. It's got a nice mirror smooth finish, so we're going to say it's good. But we want to clean it because we want to make sure that the travel happens through the full extent of the lifter. So this inside here, there's a plunger, and it uses some oil pressure to kind of take up, I guess, the lash in your valve train. And when we run a cam with a different lift, you're going to get some change in your clearances. So this is going to take up the slack, but because this has a lot of miles on it, you might have some varnish inside the lifter body and the plunger inside here, and it could potentially stick. And then if it sticks, you're in trouble because you might hold the valve open, and that'd be no good. These are rebuildable, and they're easy to take apart and clean, so that's what I'm going to show you right now. So you can kind of see barely inside here, there is a C-clip. So we got to get that C-clip out. So I'm using here just a pick, and not too particular about which pick you want to use, just want something with a little bit of a curve in it. You also want to keep your thumb over this in case this clip goes flying off into space and you never find it again, so hopefully that doesn't happen here. I just did one, I've got a whole bunch more to do, and as long as we can do this without any hiccups, it'll go pretty smooth. So, I don't know if you can see it, but there is your C-clip. And then we're going to tap this on the bench here. Out comes the body that supports your push rod. So push rod meets your lifter support. It's got a nice cup in it. It's got a hole in it for a little bit of oil. Inside here is this disc, and it's a very thin little disc, and I found that because it's got oil surrounded in it, it's kind of stuck in there, so it doesn't like to come out with just, tapping on the bench. Sometimes it'll fall out, but what I have here is a nice clean, relatively clean magnet. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to get him in there, and I'm going to try and get him out. But typically what happens is the whole plunger assembly comes out, which I know if it was stuck, they wouldn't want to come out. So this little disc here would want to come out. So grab my plunger now and try and work this magnet around to get our little tiny wafer thin disc out. Right there. Looks like a glop of oil. I'll clean that off so you can get a better idea what we're looking at here. So in the order that these go together, I'll start on this side is the top, and we'll go to the bottom. So we got our bore. This is the part that we're going to clean up really nice, and we're going to take completely apart. On the bottom of your bore, you've got a check ball and a spring. So you want to make sure those are together just right. Inside here, the way down here, there is the check ball, and then there's a retainer back here. And this one, you want to take a straight punch, which I seem to have misplaced, but this one is straight enough on the end that I can reach in here. You just got to get through that hole, and you got to pop that out, and hopefully it doesn't go flying everywhere. So there is that. See, spring inside this cup. You want to make sure it goes in the right spot. Here's your ball. So there's that, and then your lifter body. So we're going to clean all these up with some brake clean, and then we'll put it back together. Now then, some of you might be wondering, well, where the heck's all this varnish buildup happening? Well, it's happening right along here and here and in here, because what's happening is, how this works is you have oil pressure filling the void in the cylinder here, and there's a couple of checks, those balls that we took out, those are your checks, and so this guy moves up and down to compensate for any kind of lash. So what can happen is, if you got varnish in here or on these surfaces, these are using oil as a kind of a hydraulic seal, so you want to make sure that the varnish is cleaned out of here. So all I'm doing is, because these are coming apart pretty easy, I'm not seeing a whole bunch of varnish buildup. I am cleaning these out, but if they're really gunky, I might soak them in some carb cleaner or something. But all I'm doing right now is the rag and the brake clean. I'm using a lint-free shop towel here, and I'm just wiping the inside out and giving it with the brake clean. So I'm going to keep doing that, and then we'll put it back together. Okay, so there's a couple of concerns that some of you may or may not bring up, and I want to address those beforehand. So, yes, these need oil inside them to build up that lash. So what happens when you put them in dry, like these are right now? Well, what's going to happen is there's going to be basically there's going to be a bunch of slack. There's going to be no real tight pressure for about 10 seconds or so, until oil pressure builds up, and then these will get nice and tight and your valve train will not make noise. When you first start the engine up, you might get a little bit of clatter because these are bled down. That is okay. If they never pump up, then you're going to have a big problem. But immediately upon startup, you're going to get oil pressure fed into these, and they're going to pump up, and you're not going to have any problems. So putting these in dry, or not dry, but bled down, not a problem. Other thing is, when you're putting these together, you may think, well, there's a hole here and there's a hole here. Do these need to line up perfectly to get oil? No. If you can see, these have a step down that's machined into them. And naturally, these float around in there because there's nothing retaining them. And so these don't float around because you got your keepers, and they got this tab machined in here, so that way these can't spin, because that would be bad for the roller. But the orientation of these, whether you go in this way or in this way into your engine, not important. And you don't have to line these holes up. Oil pressure is going to get fed into this no matter what direction it's oriented. You can't put these in sideways, because then you can't get your keepers in to keep these straight. Keepers, dog bones, whatever you want to call them. And then these, because they spin around inside here anyways, or float around in here, they have a step machined into them, so you can't mess that up either. So oil's going to get to this no matter what. So these come apart easy and they go back together easy, and they're pretty hard to screw up. As long as all the parts go in the same way they came out, and you got oil pressure when you fire the thing up, you're going to be fine. Alright, so let's start putting it all back together here. So I'm going to take my bore, I'm going to put my spring in there. And you want to get your spring, you just got to wiggle it, and get your spring sitting there nice and flat. And then we're going to have to actually do that here in a second. We'll put that aside, take your cup, you want to make sure your tiny spring is sitting in there, and then that's going to support your check ball. And that goes on the smaller recession here on your plunger. So they go in there like that. You can push it up in there with your finger, or not. If you don't think you're square or centered, you just give some taps on the table there. Now it's perfectly centered up, and it's just pushed in there. So There's that. Our spring in there just right. And yeah, we do want a little bit of oil, but not too much, because we want to leave some air in here for now, just so that way we can get all these back together. And so that way when you put the engine together and you put all these parts in your motor, there's some room for your lash, because if these lifters are too pumped up, then they'll have a hard time bleeding down, and you could potentially have them hang your valve open. So start out with some air, no big deal. So you can see there's some spring tension now. Well, that's air that's in the body here. And what you can do, because we want to push this further down in here, is you want to get down in that check ball down in there. You just take your pick and you just push on that check ball, and now look, it's all the way down in the hole there. Take our disc. I'm going to put a little bit more, just a tiny bit of oil in here, just a tiny bit. A drop or so. Want a little bit of pre-lube on startup, just a tiny bit. Put our disc back in the hole there. Put our cup back in the hole. Now, what you can do is, if you want to push this down further, you can take a push rod and you can shove it down in there like that. I'm finding that with this, they give you enough that you can use your thumb. Again, all you're doing is fighting some air pressure right now. So I put my thumb in there and I get one in started. And then I keep my thumb on it so it doesn't go flying off on me. And I take a little flathead here, and all I gotta do is just work this other guy down and in like that. Flip it around. Make sure all of our C-clip is in the groove there like it is. And then what you want to do is you want to take your push rod and you want to push on it and make sure it works. And see, I can move it up and down. So it works just fine. So now I gotta do another 14. That's how you do push rods on this thing. So I'm gonna do all the other 14 of these and we'll move on. After we're done with the lifters, we're going to take the old springs off and we're going to install new stem seals. We're going to check for play in the valve seats, and then we're going to replace these springs with new comp 910s. So this is the valve spring compressor tool that I use for the majority of my jobs, including the IDI. It's a performance tool W84002. Yeah, it's made in China. Gosh dang it. But it's really simple. You just take one of your rocker arm bolts out, you take that same bolt and you just crank that thing down on there, and then it's just a nice fulcrum to compress your valve. It works really good on any kind of setup, as long as you can, you got enough space in there to get this cranked down to attach to the top of your valve. But that's all I did. I just bolted it down on there, and then I just pried down on it. And that way I can, with my other hand, get in there with my magnet and pull the keepers out, and then loosen it up, take it off, pull the valve off, and I can get in there and do my valve stem seals. Alright, so after we did our lifters, we put them back where they belong. I buttoned up the front of, or the top of the engine, and then I moved on to buttoning the front of the engine up, and then we are going to mount our accessories. I've been taking my breaker bar here and rolling the engine around for a while, and the things I've read about this particular engine and these serpentine systems that Ford came out with for only 2 years or 3 years is so they have I have the open spring design, and if you put the wrench on here to take the slack off this thing, it kind of walks like in and out a little bit, and I'm a little concerned about that. But when I bought this belt had almost rallied itself off the front, so I'm thinking that by setting these back, it'll keep this more centered. I mean, this is the only one that I'm worried about. The rest of these have guards and stuff. The other pulley here, the belt here on the back side, is starting to get awfully close to, in fact it is, rubbing on the back of the guard. So I still got to figure out how to get this all straight and true, but the only thing I can foresee is maybe if I pull the crank pulley out a little bit, I can get this straightened out. But if I bring the water pump out, it's gonna just pull this belt right off the front, and I don't want that. So I gotta experiment for a while. I'm trying to figure out how many shims to use, and currently I'm not using any, which this had 2 when I took it off, and this had 1. So again though, with 2 up front here, it was pulling the belt off the front of it. So trying to get your belts nice and straight and true is the only thing you gotta put some experimental thought into doing, but that's about it. Otherwise, I think I'm gonna be pretty happy with it. I may try and find an upgrade to this particular part, but there's only so much you can do, because these they like re-drilled it or drilled a different size or moved all this around in the updated version. So I have to get a whole new bracket, and that's not what I'm wanting to do. So I might just end up buying a new one of these and trying that first. So we'll figure it out. Alright, so I'm gonna give that a try. We'll see what happens when I fire it up. Either the belt's gonna stay on and it's gonna be happy, or it's gonna come flying off and everything's gonna be jacked. So we'll see. But as you can see, you don't have a lot of room here on this pulley either. It'd be kind of nice if it had a guard on either end. That would pretty much eliminate a lot of your problems, but I digress. So it runs a little bit towards the back here, but that brings it up and tries to keep it straight on this guy. Water pump has gotten 0 shims on it, which is probably where it's gonna have to be, and I got 1 shim on the crank pulley to help keep this from riding right on the edge here. So we'll see how it goes. We'll see how it sounds. But there's my front accessory drive. Hopefully this vacuum pump works. If it doesn't work, that's okay. I have another one, but I gotta swap pulleys and do more work. So hopefully it works just fine. So that's going to do it for this episode. In the next episode, we're going to be doing a bunch of floor pan repair. We're going to be doing some prep work. We're going to be taking the old engine out. We're going to be making new motor mounts for the new engine. Just kind of a bunch of miscellaneous stuff to kind of get you up to date on where we're at now. I do have an electrical wiring video coming up, because I plan on redoing the whole harness for this truck, because I've got a whole ton of new elements that I'm going to be adding into this truck. And I want to make it nicer than the new trucks that you can go buy at the dealership, while still looking original. You know, as far as I want to adhere to the style that the engineers laid out for this truck. So that's going to be kind of my own little art project. Now that I'm down to 1 project, I don't have to be torn 6 different ways from Sunday, and I can put all my effort into making this nice. And hopefully means I'll have more time and energy to film everything I'm doing too. So, you know, I appreciate all 420 some of you guys taking interest in what I'm doing, and I like these trucks, and I'm glad other people like these trucks and they like seeing what I'm doing to these trucks. So stay tuned, there's a lot more coming.